Okay, we're really behind schedule because we've had very interesting discussions and debates, and we will be closing the morning session. What can I say? I'm a journalist for Comercio, working for many years in this area of gender violence and equality. What can I say about TEMIS, the legal association, and Ms. Maria Fernandez? She is the president of this organization since 2014, and it's an organization of lawyers, prosecutors, female lawyers, prosecutors, specializing in the elimination of any discrimination in the criminal civil code, because we still have them. So no more words left for me. I will give the floor to the speaker, and then you can ask her questions. Thank you very much for your introduction. Thank you also to the organizers and Marcelo, the president, the chair, for inviting the TEMIS Association, and in particular for inviting us to speak about this topic of violence, a topic we've been working on since '87. We have a free legal support program for women and girls who have been trafficked for sexual exploitation. And we have a program, and it's available for anyone. And if you present here need some free legal aid, you can contact our association for any kind of violence, for civil matters, for criminal matters. And as my colleague here has said, we've been working for a long time to bring discrimination to an end, because only from the framework of equality we can bring violence to an end. The topic that I'm here to address is trafficking as slavery, 21st century slavery. This is one form of violence, but it is also an extreme form of violence against women and girls. They are the main victims. And in order to understand the concept of human trafficking, I have to go back to the definition included by our criminal code. The criminal code in Article 177(2) includes trafficking, the procurement, transportation, and reception or transfer and control over people when violence is used, intimidation, or fraud, or when there is some situation of superiority or vulnerability of the victim, be it a national or a foreign person, or whenever there is payment or benefits in order to obtain consent from the person by the person who has control for the following goals: imposition of forced labor, sexual exploitation, including pornography, exploitation for crime, organ extraction, or forced marriages. As you see, in itself, the article is difficult to disentangle. And at the end of my presentation, I will go into one of the essential elements of this article that has to do with the vulnerability. I will speak about this because from TEMIS, we criticized this when the criminal code was amended. In the article itself, we see an understanding of what a victim is. It's any individual where we have evidence or signs where there are signs of this conduct already mentioned, but even when exploitation has not come to term, or when there is a complaint or not, regardless of whether there is a complaint or not. And the consent of a victim of human trafficking becomes irrelevant when any of the means we have listed has been used, and especially when this behaviors or conducts happen for a minor, that will always be included as human trafficking, even if those methods have not been used. In the matter of vulnerability I referred to before, This is something introduced by the reform of the Criminal Code of 2015, and vulnerability is defined as a situation in which the person does not have any real alternative or acceptable alternative but to be subjected to abuse or to exploitation. In my association, we were against this point in the reform because if you realize, then it will be the courts, the judge, in its case, who has to assess whether the victim is in a situation of vulnerability or not, and mainly whether they had another option out of that situation. The problem we have with gender violence and with the different types of abuse that women face is that most likely the law and judges and people who have to interpret the law are people with different mindsets and different ideologies. And this element leads us to question the proper implementation of the law. This is not something that our association claims. If we go to the report of the Attorney General of 2013, same as for 2014, we read that many of the proceedings started are going to be overruled due to different reasons. First, because there's no criminal aspect in the conduct, or because there is no abusive behavior proven. So whenever the use of violence can be proven and intimidation can be proven, they can open a case, but it is impossible to get a sentence when there is a situation of abuse or a situation of superiority if the victim is not underaged. So this reform of 2015 is not a step forward, but quite the opposite. It's a step backwards in how the victim can then argue vulnerability in front of a court. As we are so much behind schedule, I'm going to summarize. Trafficking in women for sexual exploitation, as I said at the beginning, is a form of gender violence or violence against women. This is not something that I'm saying, Amalia is saying, myself is saying, or the association. This is something that is introduced in the integrated plan against women trafficking and trafficking in girls and women for sexual exploitation of the Spanish ministry. This means that when we look at the data, when we analyze the data on trafficking by the UN Office for Drug and Crime, we come to three important conclusions. First, that sexual exploitation is the first goal in human trafficking. Secondly, that 2 out of 3 victims of human trafficking are women. And three, that in the case of trafficking for sexual exploitation, the percentage of women is far higher. This is also seen in the introduction of the Parliament and the Council of 2011, that is the basis for our plan, where they introduce the specificities of trafficking from a gender perspective. Human trafficking, the state affects disproportionately large numbers of girls and women due to their higher vulnerability, due to the following factors. First, the social organizational system that perpetuates inequality models, gender-based inequality models, and allows for the devaluation of women and girls generally, and particularly in those situations of armed conflict or population displacement, or women who belong to different ethnic minorities. Secondly, due to the feminization of poverty. Thirdly, on inequality in education, training, and in the workplace. And finally, the exploitation of the desire to migrate by women who try to make a better living elsewhere. Therefore, we see that women and girls are in a situation of higher vulnerability in the face of perpetrators or traffickers. Violence against women has to be defined as well in this crime of human trafficking in a context of inequality and discrimination of women in general. What do we have then? This is a structural situation based on existing social models models that is based on discrimination against women and in societies in which men have more power. What do we need in order to stop trafficking? First, we need to have a strategy. This is already a process that started at world level, at international level, and at European level, and in the Spanish plan. And we need to change the social and cultural model so that we come to an actual equality between men and women and having equal opportunities. And secondly, by decreasing the vulnerability of women and girls in terms of trafficking. So this takes us to the most important and essential element, that is demand. Demand is the key for prevention, and it is also the key for the eradication of this practice. So we are seeing that in demand, we are studying, and recent studies, we see that it is young men and boys who are demanding prostitution, and at shockingly early ages. So we have to eradicate demand, and we really need to understand it so that we can reduce it. From the European Commission has set up some research to see how we can reduce demand, and then if there's more demand, then there's more trafficking, so that they can supply services, so to speak, of these clients of prostitution. So any measures stemming from this research will go towards creating legal measures to punish customers or clients, and also sensitizing society to reduce demand. That's why we've seen that human trafficking is not going to demand active prosecution of the traffickers. It will not just mean that we have to go against the economic profit coming from trafficking, but the establishment of measures for the remediation and the recovery of victims, and in general terms, measures to go against inequality and achieve equality between men and women.
Now, thinking about actions for equalitarian education, in that case, the message is tolerance zero for sexual exploitation, and at that in that environment, the media is particularly important, as we have heard in the previous panel. When it comes to publishing services in their advertisements, they're in fact collaborating in that situation, and they're making money out of it as well when they publish those advertisements. Thinking about the European framework, I just wanted to mention that the first time trafficking was regulated internationally for sexual exploitation, that was the Palermo Protocol. It was the first international mechanism at an international level for policy making. We hear about transport, reception, finding these women resorting to threats. And at the Palermo Protocol, all of those terms are mentioned, and there is a priority for prevention and protection of the rights of victims over and above any other objective. Now, I just wanted to quickly mention as well the European Union strategy to eradicate human trafficking from 2010 to 2016, with 5 priorities that we have copied in our national plan. Finding and protecting potential victims, strengthening protection, improving collaboration, and finding new trends for this type of crime. These are 5 priorities that have been the result of all the regulations that we've had since the year 2000 up until the present time. What has happened nationally? Well, we've had different
para
criminal
tratar
law
de,
reforms.
primero, aumentar los hechos constitutivos de delito de
To
trata.
first
Hemos
have a
incluido el
longer list
mecanismo de
of
referencia de control sobre la
situations that
persona.
will be
Entre
criminal.
las formas de comisión, la entrega o
For
la
instance,
captación de pagos o
the
beneficios
delivery
para
or
tener el
receiving
consentimiento del que
of
controla a la
payments
víctima y entre las
to
finalidades
control
también
the
hemos
victim. And
incluido la
also,
legislación
one
para
of
que
the
las víctimas
objectives we have
cometan actos
included is
delictivos para los explotadores
exploitation,
y la celebración de
where
matrimonios forzados.
victims
También
do
hemos
carry out
denunciado
certain
otros delitos
activities
de violencia.
for their
Se ha regulado el
procurers.
decomiso,
Um,
se ha incluido
Other
que en este
regulations
tipo de delitos aquellas condenas
now
puedan ser
include
cumplidas en los países de origen.
what happens
También
at
se han
customs, like
admitido como penas
confiscation
las
and seizure.
prohibiciones, las penas privativas
We also have
de derechos.
different
Y en cuanto a la prescripción en el tema
sentences
de trata de menores, no
for different
empezará a correr
levels, and
hasta que
then
la menor haya
trafficking
cumplido la mayoría
for
de edad.
underaged
Pero lo más
girls
importante,
or
y dejando un
victims.
poco la ponencia
The
a un
situation has
lado,
changed
es
there.
que al igual que en el tema de la
I
violencia
here
de
wanted to
género y la
mention
ley
that
integral,
just
no
when
toda
we
esta
talk about
trama
the
podríamos
general
convertirlos
law
todo
on
en una cosa son las leyes
victim
formales,
violence
supranacionales,
against women, we
que han
have the
entrado
same
a
type
formar
of
parte de nuestra
limitations.
normativa
We
nacional,
do now
y otra
have
cosa es la
international
realidad
laws
en el
that have
mundo, que
been
nos encontramos muy
transposed
perdidos en el manifiesto de
here
todos
in our
los informes
country.
de la
But then we
Fiscalía
have
y también por
reality,
el
and we
propio
have the
Defensor del
information that
Pueblo.
Public
Nos
Procurement
encontramos con
Office
que
gives
son
us or
delitos
the
difíciles,
Ombudsman
delitos que se
has
producen
given
en la
us. They tell
clandestinidad
us that
o
this is a difficult
grupos
situation
organizados
because it all happens
y
by
sobre todo que las
organized
víctimas son muy vulnerables, son
groups
personas en la mayoría están en
undercover.
situación irregular
The
y lo que
victims
no tienen
are
es un
very
mandato. Por lo
vulnerable.
tanto,
They're
para
here
poder combatir el
without
problema
a
necesitaríamos
legal
tenerlas
status. So,
no
to
se tienen en
combat
realidad.
this
¿Por
situation,
qué?
we
Porque
should
estamos
first
hablando de
have access
que
to
del
information
número de
which
atestados que
nobody
se
has at the
producen
moment.
al
We
número
now
de
talk
procedimientos que se
about
inician, el
the
atestado es porque la policía pone
cases
en
where the
conocimiento,
police
luego se inician en
informs
juzgar
the
y
public
las diligencias son
prosecutors
ya el
that there have been
procedimiento penal
certain
que se abre. Pues
situations,
desde
as
el número de
opposed to
atestados a los
cases
procedimientos de
where
diligencias
formal complaints go
vemos
to court. If we compare those two figures,
que el
we
número
find
baja
that
continuamente. Pero
there's a
si luego nos
huge
vamos de
loss
los
of
hechos que se
cases or
enjuician a
potential
los hechos
cases
que se
there. And
condenan,
then if we
como bien
compare
digo, el
cases
informe de la
that finally
Fiscalía,
go to
las
court
condenas
and
son muy bajas. Y sobre todo si encontramos con la protección
cases where
de la víctima.
people are
Es cierto que
condemned,
desde las
again,
asociaciones como
that
mujeres juristas
the
TEMIS
figure
o
is
como
so
ABRAN
much
o
lower.
Proyecto Esperanza,
Uh,
por un lado tenemos
Themis
apoyo
Association
jurídico,
and
apoyo
other
judicial,
associations
pero lo
that work
cierto
in this
es que para
area
reconocer que
provide
determinados
some
derechos debe de
legal
ir elaborada la
protection, and yet
Constitución.
we
Tiene un
still
periodo de
need these women
reflexión
to
que ha pasado de un
collaborate
mes a 90
with the
días. Pero
judiciary,
¿qué ocurre
and
si
all
esos
of this
90 días
over a
la
period of
víctima
time that
no
can range
colabora?
from 1 month to
Pues que sus
3 months.
derechos
What
no
happens
ejerce derechos
if
y tenga
she
una
doesn't
situación de
respond well
fragilidad
during
irregular.
that
Cuando
period?
decimos que la víctima va a ser
Are they
tratada con
going
un
to
tiempo
have some
protegido,
rights? Are
nos
they going to be
encontramos
able
que en la
to stay
mayoría
in
de los
this country?
juzgados
Are they
esa
going to be
protección
protected
intervenirá
witnesses?
en
And what
nula
does that
porque
protection
los
actually
expedientes
entail?
están a la vista de todo el
Um,
mundo. Incluso las
Really,
puertas
it doesn't
de
happen because the
policía, Guardia Civil,
information
cuando llevan sus
is
atestados, hay veces que lo dejan
there
allí y
for
ellos mismos te comentan como
almost
letrada de la
anybody
víctima
and
que allí
everybody
no,
to
que no hay
see.
ningún
Um,
control, que esa víctima
and
no está
they
siendo
confess
tratada
this
como
to us.
testigo
The police
protegido.
officers and
Por último,
clerical
no
staff
contamos con
at
que esa
courts
víctima en
tell
su
us
país
that
de origen tiene unas
that right
presiones
to
y está siendo
secrecy
presionada o
is not
amenazada
actually
por causarle
respected.
algún mal
We
a
should
su
also
hijo o a su
remember that
familia. Por
in
lo
their
tanto, es
countries of
importantísimo que la
origin they
víctima
have this
colabore con su
huge
defensor.
threat
¿Por qué? Porque la
from
coacción y
these
la presión se le ejerce sobre
criminals
todo en un
who
país de
say
origen.
that
Y
they
esa
will hurt
colaboración,
their
esa
families,
coordinación entre
their
los distintos
acquaintances in
servicios
their
del
countries
organismo
of
aún
origin.
no está
And
lograda. Es
we
cierto que
have
estamos
no
avanzando,
possibility really
pero
to
no está
coordinate
lograda.
our
Por lo
efforts
tanto, nos encontramos
between us here
con temas
and
de
the
violencia de
countries of
género,
origin.
que jamás
Some steps
la
have been
violencia
made
que ejercen
in
la
that
trata de
sense,
menores y
but it's
niñas
still not
son
happening.
unos
And
grandes
that's why we have those
inconvenientes y
huge
con una protección informada,
disadvantages
pero
and
realmente esa
barriers
protección
where
no es tal y la
protection,
víctima no
formal
siempre
protection is
condiciones
concerned.
en la mayoría de los
It
casos de poder colaborar.
in real life, it just does not happen, which is why victims very often refuse to collaborate. Very often the original statement is not recorded, so there's no formal contradiction then with what she says at court, and that is why the verdict is finally innocent for these criminals. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your brilliant presentation, Amalia, and I would like to thank you very much for your brilliant presentation, Amalia, and I would like to do only a short comment that this problem of trafficking of women with sexual exploitation is connected closely with social and political condition in the country, with poverty, and as a result of war, different military conflicts, and for example, in the occupied territories of Ukraine, violence against women has reached high level. Against women is carried out physical and sexual abuse, and we deal with high trafficking also. And the situation is very similar, so that contained elsewhere in Eastern Europe, for example, in Caucasus, Georgia, Moldova, Nagorno-Karabakh. And as for Ukraine, I would like to say that as a result of the conflict, more than 1 million of Ukrainians were forced to leave their homes, and among them, 2/3 are women who fared with children and older members of the family, caring for them, having extremely low support. And all this creates conditions for prostitution and trafficking. So it's a great problem for Ukraine now. It's so your presentation was very actual, is very actual. Thank you.
Right, looking at the time, I think we can have maybe 15 minutes now for the Q&A session, for the debate from the floor. Maybe you want to have something to say. Oh, Maria Jose over there. Great. I wanted to say that I've really thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. And I wanted to mention something that I find terribly concerning: the lack of political will to eradicate trafficking in Europe, in my opinion. I think there's a discourse in political parties, the general discourse, right, where trafficking needs to be abolished and they want to do it. But looking at what police forces do, the intelligence systems in different countries, I can't believe that they can't control or better control trafficking. Let me give you a recent example, which has to do with terrorism, where by definition terrorist groups are closed. Logically, they don't tell anybody what they're about to do, and yet the police manages to get to them and find out, and somehow a lot of the time avoid things happening and terrorist acts happening. Whereas in trafficking, they need to find customers. So surely infiltrating and getting there and talking to them should, by definition, be a lot easier. And we had a recent case in Gijón in this sense, where fortunately the police found out, and that was through customers they did it. And I wanted to ask you for your opinions. I understand that the situation is not simple. You need to find witnesses who are prepared to declare at court and so on. But I would like to hear your opinion. What kind of mafias or black hands are controlling what, apart from trafficking, that cover that up? Well, I totally agree with what you said. I didn't want to be controversial, and I was quite hoping that the question would be asked, to be honest. As a professor, I have taught for at least 10 years the police forces and the security forces, and I've always asked them, why is it so easy to have phones tapped, for instance, for drug dealing and not for trafficking? And they often tell me, yeah, well, judges don't like phones being tapped very much. And I tell them, yes, but you know that you sometimes don't respect that, right? And you do some research beforehand before you go and ask the judge. They tell me that the police have been following a suspect to this park in Madrid, where prostitution is very common. And then I ask them, but then you get to the park and you don't follow them anymore. Surely they could tell you that they went to the park just for a walk, right? Whether you're following the lady or their procurers, and they stop at that. They stop when they should finally find the information. I think it's a very similar situation to what we can see in gender violence. We're talking about women who die, who are killed by their intimate partners. And I think what's missing there is that we don't acknowledge these women as victims in the media sufficiently. For instance, when there is a terrorist attack, you quickly say, well, the perpetrators were terrorists straight away. Whereas when a woman is killed in a situation of gender violence, she's questioned. Did she lie? What was she doing? Yesterday, for instance, there was a piece of news where two members of the civil guard here in Spain were battered, and the president of our government said, well, this will not remain like this. We will find out somehow. Well, what about the woman who was killed yesterday as well? Will there be no impunity for those perpetrators? Will the king and queen of Spain send their condolences to that woman's family, just like they do in the case of an act of terrorism? What does this mean? That these women, these victims, are not acknowledged as victims. And as long as that remains the same, there might be laws in our countries, international regulations, but that will lead nowhere. So we have laws and regulations, true, but what is missing is implementation of those laws and regulations. And for that to happen is for the mindset to change, for us to understand that publicity, like we've seen here today, is still saying that women are inferior, that we live in a situation of inequality and that is accepted. As long as that remains the same, violence will continue. Any further questions or comments from the floor? Apologies, but the sound is not reaching the booth. Oh, now it's working. Well, I think that in some 40% of cases there is illegal situations with immigrants and trafficking for sexual purposes. What that means is that in trafficking, supposedly there's always an intention for exploitation, and not so when money is given for illegal immigration or irregular immigration. But we shouldn't forget that those two situations are very often connected. And when there is an armed conflict, you are right, it's those situations where women are particularly exploited, often for sexual purposes. So those movements of people, of migration, makes these women and girls much more common. Smuggling and trafficking often go together, and these women are being exploited and raped at terrible, terrible levels.
Should I ask you? Okay. How many different bodies, structures, social institutes are involved to the struggle against trafficking in Spain, and how they organize their common work
¿Y cómo
in this
organizáis vuestro trabajo
direction?
para un
How
poco
many,
colaborar o
not
para...
how many, which kind
Bueno,
of
tampoco os pregunto
bodies,
el
social
número
institutes
exacto, pero un poco para
involved,
hacerme idea
and
del
how
tipo de
they reach
centros, de asociaciones, de
aim,
instituciones
common
públicas
aim.
también que trabajen en
Thank
el
you.
tema de la trata.
Mira, yo desconozco las organizaciones y las asociaciones que lo llevan.
There are organizations and associations elsewhere, but we work at state level. We provide free legal aid, and we are also there as the support for the for the victims of gender violence and for trafficking victims. So we are legal aid for them. Then there are other associations that are also widely known in Spain. That is the APRAN Association and Proyecto Esperanza. These two associations actually support shelter, for example, and shelter for victims of gender violence, and also they provide support in terms of looking for a job. They are removed from the trafficker, and they have some time to recover, and they try to take them out of that network and give them the emotional support that they need and the protection that they need when they are thinking about whether they want to cooperate with the police or not. They have to be taken out from the situation. But the problem is what we were saying before, that they have to cooperate with justice, because if they don't, then they don't have any access to these kinds of support. That shouldn't be like this. And though we have standards that say that we could have special permission, but it is really very difficult to get these permits, for example, a certificate to live in the country legally, and women are really without any kind of protection. Thank you very much to the President of TEMIS. Thank you very much to all of you. And at 5 o'clock, see you back here. Thank you very much, and go for lunch. Have a nice lunch.
Claro, es que teníamos tanto, ¿sabes? Que
No, pero...
me ha dado pena, pero es que la gente ya está muy cansada.